The hall smelled of pine smoke and melted candle wax, and Willa had told herself, 3 times now, that the trembling in her hands was only the cold. It was not the cold. She stood near the back of the great stone hall, where the firelight barely reached, holding the edges of her cloak together, as if the wool could hold her whole body steady. Around her, the pack had gathered for the presentation, the night when every wolf who had come of age, every newcomer who had earned a place, every Omega who had been claimed by promise, was called forward by name and welcomed before the others. Banners hung from the rafters, the old colors of the Hallowmere pack, gray and deep green, stitched with the running wolf that had marked this territory for longer than anyone living could remember. Willa had sewn her own dress for tonight. It was simple, pale linen dyed with crushed elderberries, until it took on the color of dusk, and she had stayed up 3 nights finishing the hem by firelight, because her fingers were better with thread than her tongue was with words. She had imagined more than once the moment Edric would say her name. She had imagined his hand finding hers in front of the whole hall, the way he'd promised her in the dark of the orchard 2 months ago, the way he'd promised when he said no one else mattered, that her name would be spoken beside his before the pack, before the first snow came. The first snow had come 3 days ago. Tonight was the night. She watched him now across the hall, golden-haired and broad-shouldered, laughing at something his cousin had said, a cup of mulled wine loose in his hand. He had not looked at her once since she'd arrived. She told herself that was only nerves. She told herself a great many things, standing there in her elderberry dress, and most of them were lies she'd built herself out of hope, because hope was cheap and she had so little else. The pack elder, an old wolf named Garrow with a voice like gravel dragged over stone, began to call the names. One by one, young wolves stepped forward, were welcomed, were embraced by kin and pack alike. Willa's chest tightened with every name that wasn't hers. She watched the Omegas before her receive their promises, watched mates step forward to claim the bond before witnesses, watched the hall erupt in the low, howling cheer that the pack used instead of applause. Then Garrow called Edric's name. Willa's spine straightened, her hands unclenched from the cloak. This was it. This was the moment she'd sewn 3 nights for. Edric stepped into the firelight, and for one heartbeat, his eyes did find hers across the hall, and something in her chest loosened in relief. Then he turned, and he reached for someone else's hand. Sable Ashworth, the daughter of the pack's second in command, dressed in deep burgundy silk that had never seen the inside of a poor woman's sewing basket. Edric lifted her hand to his lips, right there before Garrow, before the elders, before the whole gathered pack, and said the words that should have been Willa's. I choose this bond. Before pack and fire, I claim her. The hall did not go silent so much as it seemed to tilt, every face turning, some toward the new couple in delight, a few, fewer, but Willa felt each one like a brand. Toward her, in the back, in her elderberry dress, with her hands now pressed flat against her stomach, as if she could hold herself together by force alone. Someone laughed. Not loudly, just a low, ugly chuckle near the front, quickly hushed, but she heard it, and she heard the words that followed it, passed wolf to wolf like a coal nobody wanted to be caught holding. The tree girl. Did she really think? She had heard that name before. The tree girl. It was what they called her. Not unkindly at first. Back when she'd started planting saplings around the crumbling cabin at the edge of Packland that nobody else had wanted. An Omega, with no great lineage, no impressive scent, no particular gift the pack valued. What else was she meant to do with her hands but dig holes in frozen ground and put living things into them? The pack found it strange. Some found it pitiable. Lately, watching her devotion to Edric, some had simply found it funny, a woman planting a future with a man who clearly had no intention of staying to see it grow. Garrow cleared his throat, the ritual continuing around her, indifferent to the way her whole world had just rearranged itself into rubble. Willa understood, with the particular clarity that came only in the worst moments, that she could do one of two things. She could let her knees give out, let the tears come, let the pack see exactly how thoroughly she had been broken in front of them, or she could leave. She chose the second thing, because it was the only thing she had left to choose. She did not run. She made herself walk, spine straight, chin level, through the press of bodies near the back of the hall, past wolves who looked away rather than meet her eyes, past the cousin who had been laughing with Edric only minutes before. She felt Sable's burgundy silk like a separate kind of cold against her skin, even though she never came near it. She made it almost to the great doors, before a hand, not Edric's, caught the air near her elbow, not touching, just close enough to make her stop. Leaving so soon? The voice belonged to a wolf she didn't recognize, dark-haired, quick smile, the kind of charm that came too easily to men who'd never had to earn anything. He wasn't Pack. She knew every face in Hallowmere, and this wasn't one of them. Beside him stood another stranger, broader, blunter, the kind of man who looked like he enjoyed a fight more than he enjoyed talking his way out of one. And behind them both, half in shadow near the doorway, stood a third. Willa noticed him the way you notice the moment before a storm breaks, not because of anything he did, but because of the stillness around him. He was tall in a way that made the doorway seem smaller, dark hair bound back in long, careful braids, a heavy fur mantle settled over leather, and old scars that said he'd survived things other wolves only told stories about. He wasn't watching the hall. He wasn't watching Edric or Sable, or the ritual still murmuring on behind them. He was watching her, not with pity. Pity was a look Willa had grown fluent in reading and rejecting all night. This was something else. Something that made the back of her neck prickle with a warning her wolf recognized even if her mind hadn't caught up yet. Recognition, as if he'd found something he had been looking for without knowing its shape until now. "I asked if you were leaving," the dark-haired one said again, amused, stepping slightly into her path. "Seems a poor night for it. The interesting part just started." "Let her go, Ryan," the second stranger said, though his eyes, too, lingered on her with open curiosity. "Can't you see she's had her fill of this hall?" "I can see plenty," Ryan said. But he stepped back all the same, hands lifted in mock surrender, gaze flicking once toward the silent third man, as if checking for permission he hadn't quite been given. Willa's heart was beating too fast. Equal parts, the wound still bleeding behind her ribs, and the strange new awareness crawling up her spine. "I don't know who you are," she said, and was faintly surprised her voice came out steady. "But I'd like to pass." The tall one in the doorway finally spoke. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to fill a room. "You held yourself the entire walk to that door," he said, without breaking. Most wolves twice your age and standing couldn't manage that. "Should I be flattered?" Willa asked, because some stubborn ember in her refused to let the humiliation be the last thing that defined this night. "You should be aware," he said, "that some of us noticed." Behind them, the hall was still murmuring with the ceremony. Garrow's voice rising again to call the next name. The pack already moving on from her, as if she'd simply evaporated from the night's memory. But here at the threshold, 3 strangers had stopped to watch her walk away with her dignity still intact. And one of them, the quiet one, the one whose presence alone seemed to bend the air of the room toward him, looked at her like she was a question he intended to answer. "Who are you?" she asked him directly, because if she was going to be ruined tonight, she would at least leave knowing the name of the last man to look at her like she mattered. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something more deliberate than that. "Xander," he said, "and you, Tree Girl, are coming with us. Not tonight, but soon." He turned before she could answer, his fur mantle sweeping the cold air as he went, and the other 2 fell into step behind him without question. the kind of obedience that wasn't fear, but something closer to absolute trust. Willa stood frozen at the threshold of the hall, the warmth of the fire behind her, and the bitter dark of the winter night ahead, and for the first time since Edric had lifted Sable's hand to his lips, she felt something other than grief move through her chest. She didn't know yet what it meant. She only knew that the night had cracked open into something larger than the humiliation it began with, and that whatever came next, she would not be facing it as the tree girl nobody wanted. She would be facing it as someone 3 powerful strangers had already chosen to see. Willa did not sleep that night. She walked the long road back to her cabin alone, the cold biting through her cloak in a way it hadn't on the way to the hall, when hope had still been keeping her warm. The cabin sat at the very edge of Halomir's land, where the cleared fields gave way to old forest, a place nobody else had wanted because the soil was poor, and the wind came down off the ridge without anything to slow it. Nobody, that is, until Willa had started planting. It had begun 3 winters ago, almost by accident. She'd found a handful of pine seedlings struggling in a flooded ditch near the river, roots half drowned, and something in her, something she couldn't entirely explain even to herself, had refused to let them die there. She'd carried them home in the fold of her apron and put them into the ground around her cabin in a rough, uneven line, more out of stubbornness than any plan. The pack had laughed even then. An Omega playing at forestry instead of learning the skills that might earn her a better match, a higher place, a husband with land and a name worth having. But the trees had grown, slowly, stubbornly, the way Willa herself had learned to grow in a pack that had decided early what she was worth and never bothered to look again. Now, standing in her own doorway with the elderberry dress still clinging cold and damp to her legs, she looked out at the dark shapes of pine and birch and hardy mountain ash ringing her home, black silhouettes against a sky thick with the promise of more snow, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the joke the pack made her out to be. She felt like someone had been planting something true, even when she hadn't known what it was for. She thought of the man in the doorway. Xander. She turned the name over in her mind as she built up the fire, as she finally peeled off the ruined dress and changed into her sleeping shift, as she lay beneath her quilt listening to the wind worry at the shutters. She had no business thinking of him at all. She had been humiliated in front of her entire pack not 3 hours past, and here she was, lying awake not because of Edric's betrayal, but because of 3 strangers and the way one of them had looked at her like a question worth answering. Not tonight, but soon. What did that mean? Was it a threat? A promise? She didn't know enough about the man to guess, and that uncertainty kept her turning beneath the quilt long after the fire had burned down to embers. She woke to gray light, and the particular silence that meant heavy snow had fallen in the night. Her body ached with exhaustion she hadn't earned through sleep, and for one disorienting moment, lying there, she let herself believe last night had only been a nightmare. Then she sat up, saw the elderberry dress crumpled on the floor where she'd left it, and the whole humiliation came rushing back, fresh as a wound reopened. She made herself rise anyway. There were chores that didn't care about broken promises. Water to be fetched before the well froze solid, the small flock of hens to be checked, the fire to be fed. Willa had learned long ago that grief was a luxury the world rarely gave you time to properly indulge, and she'd rather work through it than sit with it. She was breaking the ice on the well bucket when she heard hooves on the frozen track, and looked up to see a small party of riders coming through the snow toward her cabin. Her stomach dropped. Visitors out here were rare enough that they usually meant trouble, and after last night, she had little appetite left for more of it. But it wasn't Edric, and it wasn't anyone from her own pack at all. It was Ryan, the dark-haired stranger from the hall, riding ahead of the bulkier one. Bram. She would later learn his name was, and behind them both, unmistakable even wrapped in a heavier cloak against the cold, rode Xander. "Tree girl," Ryan called out, far too cheerful for the hour, swinging down from his horse before it had fully stopped. "We did say soon." "You said soon," Willa replied, straightening with the ice bucket still in her hands, equal parts wary and unwilling to show it. I assumed that meant weeks, possibly months, not the very next morning. Xander doesn't believe in waiting once he's decided something, Bram said, dismounting more slowly, eyeing the ring of young trees around her cabin with open curiosity. You'll learn that if you spend any time around him. I don't intend to spend any time around him, Willa said, though even as the words left her mouth, she felt their hollowness. Xander hadn't dismounted yet. He sat his horse at the edge of her small clearing, dark eyes moving over the trees, the cabin, the careful lines of dug earth waiting for spring, and then, finally, her. You planted all of this, he said. It wasn't a question. I did. Why? It was such a simple question, and yet Willa found she didn't have a simple answer ready. Nobody had asked her why in 3 years. They had mocked, or pitied, or simply ignored, but nobody had asked. Because they were dying, she said finally. The seedlings. I found them and they were dying, and it seemed like a waste to let that happen when I had hands and time. And you've kept planting, 3 years of seedlings by the look of these trunks. He finally swung down from his horse, and even on foot, in the gray morning light without the hall's firelight to soften him, he was an imposing figure, the kind of presence that made the cold air feel thinner. Most wolves would have given up after the pack made their opinion clear. You didn't. Most wolves have something better to do with their time, Willa said, unable to keep a thread of bitterness from her voice. I didn't. I still don't, as it happens. Or did you not hear what happened to me last night? I heard, Xander said, and something in his tone made it clear. He'd heard every detail. Perhaps even details she hadn't realized had spread. Edric made a poor choice. Edric made the choice the pack expected him to make, Willa corrected. Sable Ashworth's father will inherit Garrow's seat when the old man finally dies. I have no father worth mentioning, and a cabin nobody else wanted. The math was never difficult. The math, Xander said, assumes worth is measured only in lineage and land. It's the only measure Hallowmere has ever used. Then Hallowmere has been measuring wrong. He said it simply, without any apparent need to convince her, the way a man states a fact about weather or terrain. He walked closer, his gaze tracking along the line of young pines that bordered the eastern edge of her cabin, the birches further along, the dense thicket of mountain ash she'd planted last spring near the well. Do you know what you've built here? A garden that gives me something to do besides feel sorry for myself. A windbreak, Xander said, ignoring or perhaps simply not hearing her self-deprecation. A proper one, planted in the right pattern, dense enough on the windward side to slow a gale before it reaches the structure behind it. Most foresters take a lifetime to learn the spacing you've stumbled onto by instinct. Willa blinked at him, the ice bucket forgotten in her hands. I didn't stumble onto anything. I just put them where there was room. Did you? He said, and there was something almost like amusement in the words, though his face remained largely unreadable. Walk with me. Show me where you've planted and where you haven't. It was such an unusual request, so far from anything Edric had ever asked of her, that for a moment, Willa simply stared. Ryan had already wandered off toward her small barn, apparently fascinated by her single goat, and Bram was inspecting the cabin's roofline with the air of a man assessing whether it would survive the winter. Only Xander stood waiting for her answer, patient in a way that felt entirely unlike the rest of the pack's impatience with her. Why does it matter to you? She asked. What I've planted, or where? Because I am the Alpha King of 3 territories bound by treaty and blood, he said, and I have spent longer than I care to admit watching wolves who consider themselves powerful fail to notice the things that actually keep their people alive. You notice something. I want to understand what. The title settled over her like a physical weight. Alpha King. not merely a visiting wolf of high status, but the ruler whose name was spoken with both reverence and fear even in Hallowmere, a territory that owed him no direct fealty, but knew better than to forget his reach. She had spoken to him last night as though he were simply a stranger, had let Ryan tease her, had nearly snapped at Bram, and all the while she had been standing in the presence of one of the most powerful wolves alive. "You should have told me who you were," she said, faintly accusing, mostly to cover the sudden lurch of nerves in her stomach. "Would it have changed what you said to me?" She considered lying. She decided against it. "No," she admitted. "Probably not." "Then I'm glad I didn't tell you." For the first time, something that might genuinely have been called a smile touched his mouth, brief and almost startling in its warmth against the cold morning. "Walk with me, tree girl. Show me your trees." And so, against every instinct that told her this made no sense, that an AlphaKing had no business standing in her frozen yard asking about windbreaks and seedlings, Willa set down her bucket and walked. They walked the perimeter of her land together, while Ryan and Bram trailed at a respectful distance, close enough to hear if she called for help, far enough that the conversation felt almost private. Willa found herself talking more than she had in months, pointing out where she'd planted the pines tightest against the northern exposure, where the birches stood looser to let morning light through to the garden beds beneath them, where she'd left gaps near the southern wall because the goat liked to graze there, and she hadn't the heart to fence the animal away from its favorite patch of ground. Xander listened to every word as though it mattered, occasionally crouching to examine a root collar or run his fingers over bark in a way that suggested genuine knowledge, not performance. "You've planted for the wind that comes off the ridge," he said eventually, straightening from where he'd been studying a stand of young spruce near the well. "Most wolves around here only think of wind as a nuisance. You've thought of it as a thing to be managed." "I grew up watching my mother lose half her garden every winter to that wind," Willa said. "She never had the patience to figure out how to stop it. I suppose I inherited stubbornness instead of patience." "Stubbornness is underrated." He looked at her then, properly, the gray morning light catching the scars along his jaw, and Willa felt that same prickle of awareness she'd felt the night before, the sense of being truly seen rather than merely looked at. "Where is your mother now?" "Dead. 6 years past. A fever that took half the cabin's families that winter." She said it plainly, the way she'd learned to say it after enough years had passed, that the words no longer caught in her throat. "My father left before I was old enough to remember him. I have no pack lineage worth mentioning, no scent that turns heads, and apparently no judgment either, given who I trusted with my future. That's the whole of my history, AlphaKing. I'm afraid it isn't very interesting." "I disagree." He said it simply, the way he seemed to say most things, without flourish or apparent need to convince. "Interesting is rare. Most wolves I meet want power, want territory, want a mate who'll raise their status. You wanted to keep a handful of dying seedlings alive, because it seemed wasteful to let them die. That's rarer than you think." Willa didn't know how to answer that, so she didn't try. They walked in silence for a while instead, past the edge of her cleared land where the old forest began in earnest, ancient pines that had stood since long before Hallowmere had a name, their branches heavy with new snow. "May I ask you something?" she said finally, without it souring whatever this is. "You may ask anything. Why did you really come here? 3 powerful men do not ride half a day through new snow to discuss windbreaks with an Omega nobody else wanted." She kept her eyes on the tree line ahead rather than his face, because she suspected whatever answer came might be easier to hear without watching it form on his mouth. "Was it pity? Did word of what happened last night reach you, and you decided to make some grand gesture of kindness toward the pathetic, jilted Omega?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that she nearly regretted asking. When Xander finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier calm, replaced by something more careful, I have known what you smelled like for longer than you'd believe, he said. Not your scent exactly. Wolves like myself, with old blood and old gifts, sometimes sense things before we understand them. 3 months ago, I caught something on the wind during a treaty meeting near Halomir's southern border. A trace of something old and rare, gone before I could place its source. I told myself I'd imagined it. I did not imagine it twice more since. Willa's steps slowed. You're saying you smelled me, from half a territory away. I'm saying I smelled something that mattered, and I have spent 3 months trying to find its source, without alarming an entire pack, by demanding to sniff every Omega in their territory. A faint, dry humor touched the words, though his eyes remained serious. Last night, the moment you walked into that hall, I knew. It wasn't pity that made me stop you at the door, Tree Girl. It was recognition. The same thing my wolf has been chasing for 3 months finally had a face. That doesn't make sense, Willa said, though her heart was beating too fast for the protest to land with much conviction. I have no lineage. No one in my family has ever been remarkable. I'm an ordinary Omega with a garden nobody asked for. Ordinary Omegas don't carry a scent that travels half a territory on the wrong wind, Xander said. Ordinary Omegas don't plant a windbreak by instinct that takes trained foresters decades to learn. I don't yet know what you are, Willa, but I intend to find out, and I would like your permission to do so at whatever pace you find tolerable, rather than the pace my own curiosity would prefer. It was, Willa thought, the strangest thing anyone had ever said to her, and also somehow the kindest. Edric had never asked her permission for anything. He had simply assumed her gratitude for his attention was sufficient consent for whatever he wanted from her, right up until the moment he'd decided someone else's attention was worth more. Why ask my permission at all? She said. You're an Alpha King. I'm told men like you don't generally need to ask Omegas like me anything. Then you've been told wrong, or you've only met men unworthy of the comparison. Something flickered across his face, brief and sharp, gone before she could properly name it. Anger, perhaps, though not directed at her. I have seen what happens to wolves who take without asking. I have no interest in being one of them. They had reached the far edge of her land by then, where a low stone wall marked the boundary between her cabin's modest holding and the deeper forest beyond, territory that belonged to no pack at all, wild and unclaimed. Willa stopped there, one hand resting on the cold stone, and looked back at her cabin in the distance, small and gray against the white field, ringed by the dark green of 3 winters' patient planting. I don't know what to do with any of this, she admitted quietly. Less than a day ago I thought my whole future was decided. Now an Alpha King is telling me I might carry some old rare bloodline I've never heard of, and that he intends to find out what it means, with my permission, at my pace. It's a great deal to hold at once. You don't have to hold it all today, Xander said. Today you only have to decide whether you'll let me return, whether you'll let Ryan needlessly antagonize your goat a second time, and Bram inspect your roof a second time, and whether you'll show me the rest of what you've built here before the snow gets too deep to walk it properly. Despite everything, despite the wound Edric had left still raw beneath her ribs, Willa felt the corner of her mouth lift, the first genuine, almost smile she'd managed since the previous night. Bram was inspecting my roof? Bram inspects every roof he encounters. It's a peculiarity of his. He grew up in a pack that lost 3 cabins to collapse one bad winter, and he's never quite recovered from the habit of checking. Xander's own mouth curved slightly at that, an answering warmth that made the cold morning feel briefly less cold. He'll tell you whether yours will hold through the season, if you ask him. He won't volunteer it unless you do. Bram doesn't volunteer much of anything. And Ryan? Ryan volunteers everything, whether anyone wants to hear it or not. There was clear affection beneath the dry observation, the kind that spoke of long history, old loyalty. They are my brothers, not by blood, but by something that's held longer than blood manages in my experience. Wherever I go, they go. If you let me return, you'll be getting the three of us, not merely one Alpha King with inconvenient questions about scent and lineage. Willa looked back toward the cabin, toward Ryan crouched by her goat pen, looking thoroughly unbothered by the animal's evident disdain for him, toward Bram standing back to study her roofline with a critical eye exactly as Xander had described. Three powerful men, strangers until last night, who had somehow ended up in her frozen yard discussing windbreaks and roof integrity as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "You may return," she said finally, "though I make no promises about what you'll find. I'm not a mystery waiting to be solved, Alpha King. I'm only a woman who plants trees because the alternative was watching them die." "Perhaps," Xander said. "Those are not as different as you think." They walked back together in a silence that felt less uncertain than the one that had carried them out. And Willa found herself, for the first time since the previous night's humiliation, thinking less about what she'd lost in that firelit hall and more about what might be waiting for her in the slow accumulation of ordinary days ahead. Windbreaks and roof inspections, an Alpha King's patient curiosity, and a scent on the wind that had apparently been searching for her for 3 long months before she'd ever known to look back. The weeks that followed settled into something Willa hadn't expected to find again, so soon after Edric's betrayal. A kind of quiet contentment. Xander returned 3 more times before the deep snows came, always with Ryan and Bram in tow, always with some reason that started as forestry and ended somewhere closer to simply spending the afternoon in her company. Ryan had given up antagonizing the goat and instead taught it tricks. Willa was fairly certain no respectable goat should know. Bram declared her roof sound for 1 more winter, though he muttered something about the northeast corner that he promised to return and fix himself, an offer she hadn't quite known how to refuse. And Xander walked her land with her, asked questions that mattered, listened to answers as though they were worth remembering. He never touched her without invitation, never spoke of bonds or claims the way Edric once had in the dark of the orchard. He simply showed up, again and again, as though her company were a thing worth the long ride from his own territory. Word of the Alpha King's visits had inevitably reached Halomir. Willa heard the whispers when she went to trade eggs at the market, felt the shift in how people looked at her now, not with the old pitying contempt, but with a wary uncertainty they didn't quite know what to do with. Edric himself had not approached her, though she'd seen him once at the edge of the market, watching her with an expression she couldn't name and didn't particularly care to interpret. Sable's burgundy silk had not improved with a few weeks of marriage, as far as Willa could tell, and she found she felt nothing about that at all, neither satisfaction nor regret. It was simply no longer her concern. What concerned her instead was the conversation she'd overheard between Garrow and one of the elders 3 days past, voices low and worried in a way that had made her slow her steps outside the meeting hall. "The signs are worse than last winter," Garrow had said. "Old Marin swears she saw wolf tracks twice the size of any pack wolves, out past the northern ridge. If the wild packs are pushing this far south already, with the storm building the way it is, you think they'll come through the gap?" "I think," Garrow had said, "that we have not properly fortified that gap in 2 generations. And I do not like what the sky looks like tonight." Willa hadn't understood at the time quite how much weight those words carried. She understood now, 3 days later, standing in her own doorway, as the wind screamed down off the ridge, with a violence she had never felt in 3 winters of watching that wind from this exact spot. The storm had come fast, faster than even Garrow's worried predictions. A wall of white that swallowed the tree line and turned midday into something approaching night. Willa had barely managed to get the goat into the barn and the hens secured before the worst of it hit, and now she stood at her window, watching her carefully planted trees bend and groan under wind that felt like it wanted to tear the whole world apart. It was during the worst of that howling that she heard the other sound beneath it. Not wind. Wolves. Not pack wolves. The howl that rose through the storm was wrong, in a way Willa's instincts recognized before her mind could properly articulate why. deeper and wilder and hungrier than anything Hallowmere's bonded wolves produced. Wild packs. The kind that lived beyond any territory's boundary, that answered to no treaty, that came south in the worst winters when the deep forest no longer offered enough to eat. Her first thought was terror, sharp and immediate. Her second thought, arriving close behind the first, was Xander. She didn't know in that moment whether he was anywhere near enough to help, whether the storm had trapped him somewhere on the road between his territory and hers, whether he even knew what was bearing down on Hallowmere's northern edge. She only knew that her own cabin sat closer to that ridge than almost any other dwelling in the territory, and that whatever was coming through the gap Garrow had spoken of would reach her long before it reached the heart of the pack's lands. She reached for the heavy iron poker by her fire, useless as it likely was against a wild wolf, and that was when she heard it. A different sound entirely. Wood groaning and shuddering as wind crashed into the dense line of pines along her northern boundary. The trees she'd planted thick and close specifically to slow the gales coming off the ridge. The trees held. She watched through the frost-edged window as the wall of wind hit her windbreak and broke apart. The worst of its violence shredded into something survivable by 3 winters of patient, stubborn planting, exactly as Xander had described that first gray morning. The wild howling, too, seemed to falter at the edge of her land, the dense thicket of trunk and branch and root, creating a barrier that even desperate, storm-driven wolves found difficult to push through cleanly. It wasn't enough on its own. Willa understood that even as relief washed through her, because the howling didn't stop, only redirected, the pack of wild wolves searching for a gap, a weaker point, a way around the unexpected obstacle in their path. She heard them moving along the edge of her planted line, snarling, frustrated, and she gripped the iron poker tighter and prayed to whatever old god still listened that the trees would hold long enough. That was when she heard hooves, and then a voice she would have known anywhere, even half swallowed by the storm. "Willa!" Xander burst through the worst of the white. Bram and Ryan close behind him, all 3 already shifted partway, fur thickening along their forearms, eyes gone sharp and gold with the wolf rising close beneath the skin. He'd come, despite the storm, despite the distance, exactly when it mattered most. "Stay inside," he shouted over the wind, already turning toward the sound of the wild pack pressing against her windbreak. "Bram, the eastern gap. Ryan, with me." "There's a thinner stretch near the well," Willa called back, refusing to simply retreat behind her door, while wolves she'd grown to care for threw themselves into danger on her account. "I left it open for the goat. If they find it, then we close it," Xander said, already moving. And Willa watched in equal parts terror and astonishment as 3 of the most powerful wolves she'd ever encountered turned their full strength toward defending a windbreak she'd planted out of nothing more than stubbornness and a refusal to let dying things die. The fight that followed lasted longer than Willa could properly track. A chaos of snarling and storm, and the occasional flash of Bram's broader shape meeting a wild wolf head-on near the well, of Ryan darting and harrying at the edges the way his quick, clever nature suited him for, of Xander himself anchoring the worst of the assault at the center of her northern line, where the wild pack pressed hardest against the gap between 2 stands of pine. It was the trees, in the end, that made the difference. The wild wolves, accustomed to open forest and clear lines of attack, found themselves tangled and slowed by 3 winters of dense, deliberate planting, forced into narrow channels where Xander and his brothers could meet them 1 or 2 at a time, instead of facing the full weight of a desperate, storm-driven pack all at once. What Willa had built without any thought of war, any thought of defense beyond keeping a little garden alive against an unkind wind, had become exactly the fortress the wild wolves could not breach. When the howling finally retreated, driven back toward the wild forest beyond the ridge, the storm itself seemed to ease in sympathy, the worst of the wind finally beginning to soften into something merely brutal instead of murderous. Willa, who had disobeyed every instruction to stay inside, and now stood at her own door with the iron poker still gripped uselessly in one hand, watch three exhausted, snow-crusted men make their way back across her ravaged but unbroken yard. Xander reached her first, breathing hard, a shallow gash along one forearm already closing with the speed wolves healed at, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, snow melting in his dark hair, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she had not seen from him before. "Your trees held," he said. "They're just trees," Willa said, though her voice shook with everything she hadn't let herself feel until this exact moment. Relief, terror, something else entirely that she didn't yet have a name for. "They're not just trees," Xander said. "They're the reason none of us are dead tonight. The reason this entire stretch of Halomir's border didn't fall to a wild pack desperate enough to push through a winter storm." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat still radiating off him despite the cold. 3 years ago, you saved a handful of dying seedlings because it seemed wasteful to let them die. Tonight, that same stubbornness may have saved this entire territory. Behind him, Bram was already inspecting the northeast corner of her roof again, apparently unable to help himself even in the storm's aftermath, while Ryan leaned against the barn door, catching his breath and grinning despite the blood on his sleeve. "The tree girl," Ryan said, loud enough to carry, "just outfought a wild pack with landscaping. Despite everything, despite exhaustion and terror and the ache of adrenaline draining out of her all at once." Willa felt a laugh escape her, sudden and surprised and entirely real, the first true laugh she'd managed since long before that humiliating night in Garrow's Hall. "I think," she said, looking at Xander, at the trees still standing dark and triumphant against the clearing storm, "that I might need to plant a great deal more." News of what had happened at Willa's cabin traveled through Halomir faster than the storm itself had cleared. By the time the roads were passable again, the story had already taken on the particular shine that turns ordinary survival into legend. The tree girl who had built a fortress without knowing it. The AlphaKing and his brothers who had defended her border against a wild pack. The windbreak that had held when stone walls in other territories had failed to slow the same storm. Garrow himself came to her cabin 3 days after the storm, picking his way carefully over still icy ground, flanked by 2 of the elders who had questioned his judgment in the hall not long ago. He stood in her yard, looking up at the line of pines still standing despite their battering, and for a long moment said nothing at all. "We owe you an apology," he said finally, "for 3 years of calling this foolishness." "You owe me nothing," Willa said, though something in her chest eased slightly at the admission anyway. "I didn't plant these trees to be thanked. I planted them because I couldn't stand watching things die that didn't have to." "Be that as it may," Garrow said, "Halomir would like to formally recognize what you've built here. The windbreak, properly maintained and extended, could protect the entire northern approach. We would like your guidance in doing it. Properly. With your name attached to the work, not buried beneath it." It was, Willa thought, a strange kind of vindication, offered not because anyone had finally seen her worth on its own merits, but because that worth had proven itself in the most dramatic way possible. She accepted it anyway, because pride could only carry a person so far, and because the thought of Halomir's whole northern border eventually ringed in the kind of careful, deliberate planting she'd spent 3 lonely years learning by instinct was, in its own way, a dream worth claiming. Edric she encountered only once more, near the edge of the market, his expression caught somewhere between regret and resentment that he couldn't quite seem to resolve into either one cleanly. He didn't apologize. She hadn't expected him to. He only looked at her for a long moment, at the new ease in her shoulders, at the way the market women now nodded to her with something like respect instead of pity, and something in his face suggested he understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly what he had thrown away in that firelit hall. "You look well," he said finally, the words clearly costing him something. "I am well," Willa said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that it was entirely true. She felt no triumph in his evident regret, no satisfaction in watching him realize his mistake too late to matter. She simply felt nothing where the wound used to be, which was its own kind of healing. Xander came back 2 weeks later, once the roads had cleared enough for easy travel, and this time he came alone, without Ryan's chatter or Bram's roof inspections to soften whatever he meant to say. He found her in the yard, kneeling in the half-frozen ground near the well, tucking a fresh handful of seedlings into the earth she'd cleared that morning, undeterred by the cold or the lingering ache in her shoulders from the storm. He watched her work for a while before speaking, the way he seemed to watch most things, patient and unhurried. "More planting," he said eventually. "Always more planting." She sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands, and looked up at him properly for the first time since he'd arrived. "Garrow wants to extend the windbreak along the whole northern approach. I told him I'd need help. Apparently I'm something of an expert now, which still feels absurd to say. It isn't absurd. It's simply true, and the pack is finally catching up to a truth you've understood for 3 years." He crouched beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him even in the cold, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence comfortable in a way silence rarely managed to be. "I came to ask you something, not as AlphaKing, as myself." Willa's heart picked up its pace, though she kept her hands steady in the dirt. "Ask then." "I told you once that I had spent 3 months chasing a scent I couldn't place, and that the night I found its source, I knew it mattered, before I understood why." He turned to face her fully, dark eyes serious in a way she had come to recognize as his particular kind of honesty, the sort that didn't need volume or flourish to carry weight. "I know why now. It isn't only the scent, though that drew me here in the first place. It's everything I've watched you build since, with nothing but stubbornness and care and a refusal to let good things go to waste. I don't want a bond built on what your blood might prove to be, Willa. I want one built on what I've actually seen you do." "And what is it you've seen me do?" she asked, though she already suspected she understood, and the understanding made her chest ache with something far gentler than the grief Edric had left there. "Plant a fortress out of nothing, because it seemed wasteful to let dying things die," Xander said. "Walk away from a humiliating night with your dignity intact when most wolves would have broken. Stand at your own door with an iron poker, ready to fight a wild pack rather than hide behind a wall you'd built with your own hands. I have led 3 territories for longer than I care to count, Willa, and I have never once met anyone who built strength so quietly, so thoroughly, that even she didn't recognize what she'd made until it saved her life." "It saved your life too," Willa pointed out, because some part of her still needed the smaller, gentler moment before the larger one could properly land. "It did." A faint smile touched his mouth, the same almost smile she'd first seen in the firelit doorway of Garrow's hall, the night her whole world had cracked open into something larger than the humiliation it began with. "So, I suppose I owe these trees a debt, as much as I owe their gardener one." "What are you asking me, Xander?" she said finally, because the question had been hanging in the cold air long enough, and some stubborn part of her had learned, over 3 patient years, that the only way through uncertainty was straight ahead. "I'm asking if you'll let me stay. Not for one afternoon, not for one storm, but properly, the way a man stays when he's found something worth staying for. I'm asking if you'll let Hallomere's northern border become a place where 2 territories meet, instead of merely touch, where your trees and my pack's strength grow into something neither of us could have built alone." He reached out then, slowly, giving her every chance to refuse, and rested his hand over hers, where it still lay half buried in the cold, dark earth. "I'm asking if you'll choose me, the way no one properly asked you to choose before." Willa looked down at his hand over hers, at the seedling she'd been planting moments before, its small roots already settling into ground that had once seemed too poor and too windswept for anything to survive in. She thought of 3 winters of stubborn, solitary work, of a humiliation that had once felt like the end of everything, of a scent on the wind that had apparently been searching for her long before she'd known to look back. "Yes," she said simply, because some answers didn't need more words than that to be entirely true. "I choose you, not because you're an Alpha King, and not because of whatever old blood you think might run in me. Because you asked, instead of assuming. Because you came back through a storm instead of waiting for fair weather. Because you saw a windbreak where everyone else saw foolishness. And you were right. Spring came slow that year, the way it always did this far north. But when it finally arrived, it found Willa's cabin transformed. The windbreak Garrow had requested stretched now along the whole northern approach, young trees standing shoulder to shoulder with the older ones she'd planted alone, a living wall that Hallomir's pack tended together under her quiet, steady guidance. Bram had finally fixed that northeast corner of her roof, grumbling the entire time about wolves who let small problems become large ones. Ryan had taught the goat an entirely new repertoire of tricks that made Willa laugh more than she'd laughed in years. And in the place where Edric's broken promise had once threatened to define her entire future, there now stood something far sturdier. A bond chosen freely, built slowly, rooted as deep and patient as anything Willa had ever planted. The pack that had once mocked her for digging holes in frozen ground now sent their children to learn forestry at her side, and the territory's northern border, once its most vulnerable point, had become its strongest. Exactly as the trees she'd never stopped believing in had always promised it could be. She had come to that firelit hall as a woman everyone expected to be chosen and discarded in a single night. She left it months later as someone who had chosen for herself and built, with nothing but stubbornness and care, a fortress no storm could ever fully take from her again.